Hi, in this video I'm going to be discussing one of the most important intellectual debates of our time, and that is it Atlantis or is it aliens? These are two competing theories that have really captured the public imagination. Perhaps aliens are more marketable than Atlantis, but we can certainly see that, for example, 50 or 60% of Americans believe that Atlantis once existed. And about the same percentage of people believe that aliens also existed. So these are very, very important theories of our time. The question is which one is correct, if any or both. And so, just a brief summary of the ancient astronauts and aliens theory. It's a very modern idea, and it was first popularized by Eric von Daniken in 1968 with his book Chariots of the Gods. And I was actually personally influenced by this book, and I read it when I was a child. When I was like 12 years old, I read this book, and it made an enormous impact on me, and probably is the reason why I'm making this YouTube channel right now. And so this isn't an aliens channel, but let's just kind of go over what type of evidence that ancient astronaut theorists use to make their claims. And these claims include and this evidence includes ancient monefacts and artifacts, that's one category. And the second category is ancient texts, for example, the Book of Ezekiel and the Vimanas that are talked about in the Sanskrit epics. And so it's either monuments or artifacts or texts. And Atlantis, on the other hand, is an ancient idea. And it was first introduced over 2,500 years ago. And but it's interesting that Atlantis researchers use very similar forms of evidence as ancient astronaut theorists and ancient alien theorists. For example, we Atlantis researchers also discuss ancient monuments and artifacts that we think are related to Atlantis or could suggest that Atlantis exists. We also refer to ancient texts such as the Timaeus and the Critias and ancient myths and mythologies that I've spoken about at length in my other videos and I will in the future videos. So both Atlantis and ancient astronaut theories, there's a certain overlap in the types of evidence that we consider as important to our fields. But the difference between Atlantis research and ancient astronaut research is also important. That we focus on catastrophism, for example, sinking continents and islands, alternative geological theories, such as pole shifts, for example, special areas of the world, such as the Bermuda Triangle, volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, comet impacts, asteroid impacts. We're focused on the catastrophism, and the ancient alien and astronaut theory doesn't really work with that. That's kind of beyond the scope of their discipline, in a sense, if we could call it that. So that's just a brief overview. Let's kind of get into the more details. And again, I mentioned this in the previous video. Significant similarities. We both use textual and archaeological evidence. And we both recognize the possibility and the likelihood that early human civilizations were influenced by some as yet external and unrecognized entity. Whether that's aliens or whether that was a human civilization is where we differ. There are also significant differences, as I mentioned previously. Ancient astronauts don't really care about catastrophism. It's not that they're actively opposed to that idea. It just isn't an important aspect or important part of that kind of overall research program. And another important difference between Atlantis researchers and ancient astronaut theorists is that we Atlantis researchers are really focused on the past. Plato's Atlantis was destroyed 11,600 years ago. And while we acknowledge that Atlantis had an enormous influence on civilizations much after Atlantis, or at least some Atlantis researchers really believe that's an important part of the story, that is still in the past too. Just because we discover Atlantis doesn't mean that it's going to have an enormous impact on our everyday lives. Because the civilizations that were influenced by Atlantis are still long dead, long in the past, as I have mentioned. But ancient alien theorists and ancient astronaut theorists are focused on both the past and the present. This might be a reason why their programs and their books are more successful than Atlantis books, because the idea is that these UFOs and these ancient aliens are actually visiting us today. And it might even be building up to a potential climactic disclosure event. There's a lot more drama when it comes to ancient aliens and ancient astronauts, and a lot more relevance to our to the present day. And again, Atlantis is gone, it's dead. Even if we find it, it might not be immediately relevant. Can these competing theories be reconciled? Or are they mutually exclusive? That's a really important question because it doesn't really help if there are these two research programs that are just going off in their opposite directions or different directions and not talking to each other. Because that's not advancing the cause of actually figuring out what happened to us in the past and what's happening to us right now and in the future. So if these theories can be reconciled and there's points of mutual agreement, we should try to find them and kind of merge these research programs into one bigger discipline. And there are several obvious possibilities. One of them is that neither are true. And of course, that's a possibility. We can't just dismiss that. It could be very much the case that there is nothing to explain and we are just wasting our time. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that both are true in some way or another. That there were aliens visiting us in the past, there are aliens visiting us now, and that Atlantis existed. And of course, there's also the other possibility of only one of them is true and the other one is not. But there are also more complex possibilities that aren't just a simple one or the other, both or neither. And one of these possibilities that I really think is interesting in and of itself is that the ancient astronauts were actually human beings, right? Because the ancient astronaut theory leaves open the possibility that these so-called astronauts were not necessarily aliens. And so the question is, what if the astronauts were actually ancient humans? Now that's contradictory to the idea that the aliens could be visiting us today. If these aliens are visiting us today, then it seems very unrealistic that the aliens that were visiting us in the past were actually humans. But that is actually not completely contradictory, as I'll talk about in the future. And so that would mean that the Atlanteans had at least air technology or aircraft, and they probably had space travel technology. That is, the Atlantean technology, specifically in the realm of aerial flight, had developed to a point that is either equal to or greater than our present level of advancement. But that interpretation of Atlantis is simply not justified strictly based on Plato's text, which described Atlantis as a civilization that was probably somewhere in between the Roman Empire and the British Empire just before the Industrial Revolution in terms of its advancement. But as I argue in other videos, it may very well have been that the level of advancement of Atlantis was significantly understated, and that Atlantis may have progressed in certain areas of civilization far beyond others, that its development was not similar in its overall profile to ours, for example. And I'll be discussing that in future videos. Another important possibility is that we are actually sharing the Earth with another intelligent civilization that has kept itself hidden from us, at least until now. Or maybe that their attempts to contact us have actually increased in their frequency and their seriousness. Just as we are trying to ancient aliens or just aliens in other stellar systems and other star systems, perhaps there is a civilization that we are sharing the Earth with that has kept itself secret from us. And this concept is called Earth aliens. And it's also possible that these Earth aliens are actually related to Atlantis and that they might have been the survivors of Atlantis who chose to, for example, move underground into certain special shelters from which they would have survived the cataclysm that destroyed the remaining elements of their civilization. And so this concept of ancient Atlanteans having space travel technology and actually being the ancient aliens, and the concept of Earth aliens, regardless of whether they are related to Atlantis or not. Maybe they are even a greater mystery than Atlantis. But the idea of these two theories, Earth aliens and ancient astronaut Atlanteans, is a kind of more complicated synthesis of these two theories, the ancient astronaut theory and the Atlantis theory. And of course, only time will tell which one of these possibilities, if any, or if multiple possibilities are actually true. And this is just an overall kind of this is not like I'm not delving into the full scope and the full picture of all these different ideas, but I'm just introducing them, and I'll be talking about these ideas in more detail in future videos.